A lot of times we're told something's real complicated, but if you just cut through all the media noise and all the paid industry experts out there, it's not so complicated. Let's look at the Greek bailout. In a nutshell, here's what happened in Greece, and this isn't the first time this happens. This kind of thing happens all the time. So in Greece, the government ran up a lot of debt. Does that sound familiar? And the beneficiaries of this debt were mostly people who were well connected with the government, people who had government jobs or government contracts. Those would have been beneficiaries. Then the government bundled this debt in the form of bonds and sold it. And who bought these bonds? Well, mostly wealthy individuals. Banks bought these bonds and traded these bonds. And people knew that these bonds were risky, but they paid a good rate of return, so people were willing to take the risk. And the people who invested in these bonds, the mostly wealthy people who invested in these bonds, made a good rate of return for many years, but then the inevitable happened. Greece could no longer pay the interest on the bonds and they were in danger of default. And the banks and the wealthy individuals who owned these Greek bonds were in danger of taking a loss. Maybe they were going to lose 20%, 30%, who knows? Now, under a free market, that's the way things work. You take a risky investment, you earn a good return for a number of years, but eventually you're going to take a loss. In fact, anyone who invests in bonds from almost any country nowadays is taking a big risk. So what happened in Greece was fairly predictable and inevitable. But the banks and the wealthy individuals who owned these Greek bonds didn't want to take their loss. So they ran to the IMF. Now, a lot of people don't seem to understand what the IMF is. The IMF is basically a big bailout machine. So the IMF and the governments in Europe underwrote this bad debt. In other words, they ensured that the banks and the wealthy individuals who owned this bad Greek debt didn't take any loss. And who paid for this underwriting of the Greek debt? Well, the IMF gets its money from you, from taxpayers in countries around the world. Each country around the world generally donates some money to the IMF every year for these bailouts. Last year, the United States gave $100 billion to the IMF for bailout packages. So basically, when you cut through all the hype, what really fundamentally happened here was that wealthy individuals and banks, who were the main holders of these Greek bonds, would have taken a loss, but now that loss has been transferred to you, the taxpayer, particularly the taxpayers in Europe, but also the taxpayers in America and other countries around the world. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's probably because this sort of thing happens all the time. It's basically the same thing that happens with the subprime mortgage crisis in America. The banks took a bunch of risky loans, earned good money for many years, and then inevitably, when it was time for the banks to take a loss, they shifted that loss onto the American taxpayer. In 1994, the American government paid for what we were told was a vital bailout of the Mexican government. We weren't helping the Mexican people, we were bailing out the banks and wealthy individuals who held Mexican debt. We don't do this kind of thing to help the people in those countries. You see, the people in Greece are still going to be taxed as much as is politically possible, and as many social programs as can be cut politically will be cut. It's just that even with all those taxes and all those cuts, the Greek people still couldn't pay as much as had been promised to the holders of Greek debt, and so now taxpayers around the world are forced to make up the difference so that the holders of Greek debt don't suffer the losses that they should have suffered. Now, since the IMF is involved, there's one more thing that generally happens. In addition to being a conduit for transferring taxpayer money to holders of sovereign debt, the IMF has a second purpose. It basically goes into these countries and forces them to restructure their economy. So if the government of that country owns something of value, the IMF will say, no, you have to privatize that resource and sell it off to whatever international financial interests can bid the most. So it's a way of taking resources away from people in these poorer countries and transferring them to wealthy international interests. But again, this is basically what happens in most countries around the world under central banking. The government runs up debt, and the main beneficiaries of that debt are politically connected individuals and segments of society. And eventually that debt has to be paid off through taxpayers, through the average citizen, and through inflation of the currency, through destruction of your pension, basically, and your savings. It's just a way of transferring wealth from the average citizen to people who are politically connected and to the banking industry, which can ultimately create this money out of thin air to lend to governments around the world. So what do you do about all this? Well, recognize first of all that what we've seen is just the tip of the iceberg. We've allowed the banking industry and the financial industry to run up so much leverage that massive defaults or massive inflation are inevitable. And since the banking industry will always prefer inflation over default, and since the banking industry has a monopoly over the issuance of money, you can pretty much bet that we're going to see massive inflation rather than seeing sovereign debt in the major countries defaulted on. So protect yourself from this inflation. So as I always say, the best way to protect your wealth from this coming high inflation is to transfer your savings into anything that retains value, like precious metals or land. And also recognize that because this bad debt is going to continue to be transferred to you, the taxpayer, you're going to see much higher taxes in the future, and you're going to see lower levels of government service. You can't really count on Social Security and Medicare covering your bills when you get older. And even your pensions are going to be inflated away to a large degree. So just protect yourself from that, I would say. And if all of this really upsets you, you might consider in the future researching who donates money to political candidates before you vote for them.